Hey, Saretsky here. Welcome back to the show. Quite a bit to touch on this week. We've got some updates on Canada's CPI inflation as we prepare for the Bank of Canada's next rate announcement on September the 4th. We had some important updates from the Fed. Yes, the U.S. Federal Reserve made the all-important pivot, the pivot towards rate cuts, which we're going to get into in just a minute, as well as some movement in the Canada mortgage and bond market that I think are all important. And really, what does this all mean now for the housing market moving forward? So first and foremost, again, if you're a highly indebted, levered Canadian household sector, some good news this week. You had Canada's CPI headline inflation coming in at 2.5%. 2.5% on a year-over-year basis. Again, within the Bank of Canada's target range, they target 2% with a band that allows them to kind of go up to 3%. So it was the lowest year-over-year headline inflation reading in 40 months, okay? Again, not something to brag about considering CPI hit basically 8%, but you can see that, clearly progress has been made. Clearly, the bulk of the damage has been done, but that's kind of more so in the rear view as of right now. If you look at the CPI headline inflation, still the biggest contributor to it remains mortgage interest costs, which are at the mercy and the purview of the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada controls mortgage interest costs. So that's still running at 21%. While it is decelerating, it's still running at 21%. It's still putting upwards pressure on CPI. So if you just took out mortgage interest costs, which is what the Bank of Canada controls, you've had basically CPI running at 2% flat since about January of this year. So for all intents and purposes, inflation's in the rearview mirror. I think it can come back. I think it can come back next year. It could come back the year after. I think at some point you'll get another bout potentially of inflation. You'll have some concerns, maybe some rate hikes. But I think right now in the very near term, we're not worried about inflation. Central banks are worried about disinflation and impacts to the labor market. Is there going to be a recession? Again, Canada's already been in this per capita recession for 8 consecutive quarters. The unemployment rate's already up 100 basis points. And so there's a lot of issues that are developing here in Canada. So the rate cut has been cemented from the BOC. In September, you will get another 25 basis points cut. Now everybody says, well, oh my God, what about the Canadian dollar? 75 basis points a cut. Now the Fed hasn't moved. You got to watch the Fed. The Fed's not going to cut. The Fed is going to cut. They had a huge pivot. I mean, everybody was waiting for Jackson Hole was kind of the annual meetup for central bankers, and they come out and talk about what they're looking at. So everyone's waiting for U.S. Fed Chairman Jay Powell to talk at Jackson Hole, and he delivered. So let's clip to Jay Powell's comment right here.
Supply constraints have normalized, and the balance of risks to our two mandates has changed. Our objective has been to restore price stability while maintaining a strong labor market, avoiding the sharp increases in unemployment that characterized earlier disinflationary episodes when inflation expectations were less well anchored. Today, the labor market has cooled considerably from its formerly overheated state. Even so, the cooling in labor market conditions is unmistakable. It seems unlikely that the labor market will be a source of elevated inflationary pressures anytime soon. We do not seek or welcome further cooling in labor market conditions. The time has come for policy to adjust. The direction of travel is clear, and the timing and pace of rate cuts will depend on incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. We will do everything we can to support a strong labor market as we make further progress toward price stability.
So if you're looking for a pivot from the Fed, this was the pivot. Market reaction was this is as dovish as you're going to get. Jay Powell, the Fed is going to start cutting. They are worried about the labor market. Of course, if you were following along, the labor market had a sudden revision of about 800,000 jobs that were basically overcounted for. Oops. And so the Fed is basically behind the 8 ball now. So they'll be cutting along with the BOC. So the question now is, what does this all mean for a Canadian housing market? Is this the end of the bear market? Are we about to go into this bull market? I have some very strong opinions on this, which I'm going to share with you in just a moment. So if we take what is at face value from markets right now, right? So you're getting the cut from the BOC in September. The markets are currently pricing in 75 basis points of cuts from here on out. So if let's just assume that markets are correct, the Bank of Canada trims rates to basically that would be 3.75%. Your overnight rate would be 3.75%. by year's end. That would bring your prime rate to 5.95%, which would typically take most variable rate mortgages in Canada to about 5%, maybe slightly lower depending on the discount that banks are offering on variable rate mortgages. So best case scenario, you're kind of looking at like a 4.85, which is more or less where your fixed rate mortgages are today. So the fixed rate mortgages have already moved in advance of your variable rate mortgages. So there's really not a whole lot of relief per se in terms of variable rate mortgages spurring market activity. So I want to make that abundantly clear because we get so many people that say, well, the Bank of Canada is cutting rates, so this is going to be good for mortgage rates. And it's like, well, not really many people are borrowing on variable rate mortgages today for the exact reason that they're still priced well in excess of where fixed rate mortgages are today. So if you're a savvy shopper, you know some people at the bank, we've got clients that are getting 3-year fixed rates stay at 4.5, 4.6, 4.7 is kind of in that range of where rates are today. So I think with the Fed moving, the BOC moving, clearly we're seeing activity in the Canada 5-year bond yield market. You know, we're now sub 3%. It's been a while since we've been there. So you got your 5-year fixed yield under 3. We're seeing downwards movement in fixed rate mortgages. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that you're going to be in the low 4s by year end. Maybe it's 4%. Okay, so clearly that would stimulate some activity. We get some people off the sidelines, right? And you think about if you're borrowing at 4 or 4.1, 4.2, you know, you're being stress tested at 6.2. Contrast that to, 12 months ago when rates were 6.2, you're getting stress tested at 8.2. Clearly demand was obliterated at that time. So I think activity is going to pick up naturally, okay? Rates come down, activity will pick up. But the one thing I think people are really missing here, and we get this call from a lot of prospective sellers, a lot of our current sellers in the marketplace saying, mortgage rates are going down in September. Rates are being cut. Why don't we just hold the line on our prices? Why don't we wait to list? Don't list in August. Wait to list till September because rates are getting cut. And everybody's under the assumption that rate cuts good, housing up, prices up, and demand way up. But nobody is accounting for listings, okay? So I'd ask you to just rewind the clock. Remember all the doomsday people here in the YouTube comment section when rates went up, to 250, 300 basis points. It was like pandemonium. You're going to get this dumping, this wave of listings that are going to flood the housing market. It's all going to come crashing down in the next 6 months. Well, basically for a period of 18 months, when the Bank of Canada first started hiking rates, so basically towards the end of 2023, new listings were more or less near multi-decade lows. At one point you had a string in 2023, you had a string of months. You had about 4 or 5 months in a row where you had a 20-year low in new listings. So despite all the belief in the rhetoric that rate cuts were going to stimulate, or rate hikes were going to stimulate a flood of listings, people actually held on. They said, these aren't great market conditions. I'm going to wait for interest rates to come down. They actually delayed. They delayed listing their homes. And then slowly starting in 2024, you started to see new listings coming on. This was more just the investors in condo space that were cash flow negative, that were renewing, that could no longer stomach losing $500, $600 a month in their negative cash flow. And they started to finally add inventory onto the market, allowing listings and inventory to grow. Okay, but for a good chunk, 18 months of time, people held off from listing. And so I think, what if our sellers prepared that maybe all the rate cuts actually bring a flood or a significant increase in listings? Nobody's accounting for that. So yes, I think demand is going to increase. Naturally, rates come down, demand should increase. But I think something to keep an eye on is new listings. So we're getting a lot of prospective calls saying, hey, we're ready to list. Let's try the market. Rates are coming down. Now rates are coming down. Now is the time to try the market. And so if every seller has this mentality and this mindset, I start to wonder again, will new listings overpower new buyers in the market? And I think it's a real possibility. And so rate cuts might not be as bullish as everybody wants to believe, or might not be as bullish as all the sellers optimistically want to believe. And so there's one other thing I'd point you to, a couple other things I'd point you to just to add to that comment is, as of right now, housing units under construction in Canada are still at record highs. Housing completions, the number of homes completing and entering the market, right? A lot of the pre-sale buyers that are now closing and are going to be reselling the units is at record highs. So you still have a lot of inventory coming to market, coupled with the fact that even with mortgage rates at 4% and variable rates coming down to 4.8, 4.95%, the math really does not work still for a lot of these investors, in my opinion, right? Like going from 2 to 4 is still a significant jump, and it still destroys a lot of the math, particularly in these rent-controlled cities like Vancouver and the GTA, where you don't have the ability to pass through and pass on the increased cost of carrying the property. So I still think that something to keep an eye on is, yes, the rate cuts are coming. It's clear, it's baked into the cake. Yields are going to come off modestly lower. I think what the thing to keep in mind here is that keep an eye on new listings come sort of mid-September as you come in post-Labor Day. I think that people are going to be surprised, and there's going to be a lot of sellers that will be disappointed. And again, not just saying that prices are necessarily going to go lower, but I think that people are going to be disappointed when prices maybe don't go up for the first time when, rates are being cut. Everybody thinks rate cuts are bullish, and I still think we have some things to work through the system. So these are just thoughts. I could very well be wrong. I've been wrong in the past before. This is something I'm monitoring, and I'd be curious to see. Again, I'm just giving you my perspective from our own personal business, our contacts in the industry. What we're hearing in the chatter is everybody keeps talking again about rate cuts and getting their home on the market. And we'll see if the demand is going to outpace the listings. So, as always, hope that helped, and we'll see you next week.